Traditionally, scholars read Romans 14 as Paul declaring kosher law done away with and calling the Jewish Christians in Rome weak in faith for continuing to observe Torah. Is this the best way to read this passage? According to Dr. David Rudolph of the King's University, Romans 14 reveals Paul's understanding of kosher law, demonstrated he was even more Torah observant than the weak, who thought food was intrinsically unclean and judged others for thinking otherwise. How does he come to this conclusion? That is what we are talking about today on Bible History. Scholars such as John Barclay and Thomas Schreiner point to Romans 14:14 and 14:20 in an attempt to show that Paul nullified kosher law specifically and Torah observance in general. These verses say, "I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it unclean." Then Romans 14:20a, "Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean." I'm going to be honest. The first time I read this passage as I was exploring whether Paul remained Torah observant, these verses felt like a nail in the coffin. It seems like Paul is pretty clearly saying that kosher categories and food laws are abolished. But for Dr. Rudolph, examining this passage with the letter's Gentile audience in view and in its Second Temple Jewish context makes all the difference. Rudolph begins by addressing verse 20, which says everything is indeed clean. He says that the traditional interpretation misses the mark because it does not take the Gentile audience into account, which you could see is in Romans 1:13, 11:13, 23 through 31, and 15:15 through 16. In effect, a key clarifying phrase could reasonably be assumed, and the verse could be read as, "Everything is indeed clean for you Gentiles." As we will discuss later, this is consistent with the Leviticus 11 food commands that declare certain foods are clean and unclean for Israelites only. Dr. Rudolph then moves on to explain Romans 14:14b, that it is unclean for anyone who thinks it unclean. What does Paul mean by this? Dr. Rudolph says, given the legal terminology Paul uses in this passage, more room should be made for the possibility that Paul, a student of Gamaliel, viewed the dispute between the weak and the strong in halakhic terms, and that his advice to the Messiah followers in Rome was based on halakhic principles. Halakha is just discerning how to apply Torah commands in certain situations. And to demonstrate this, Dr. Rudolph points out two key features of the verse. First, the Greek word behind what is translated in your English Bibles in this verse as unclean is koinos. Second, Paul includes the qualifier in itself. Paul's use of koinos is notable because the word usually used to describe food as unclean in the Greek version of the Torah, the Septuagint, is akathartos. So perhaps koinos means something different than not kosher. The first time we see koinos used in relation to food is in the 1st century BCE Jewish text, 1st Maccabees and 4th Maccabees. Rudolph claims that the author of Maccabees is using koinos to describe a halakhic gray area. Otherwise clean food prepared by Gentiles who practiced idolatry. Were these items okay for a Second Temple Jew to eat? For Dr. Rudolph, this was the kind of food Romans 14:14 had in view. For Paul, food that was koinos was questionable food, not because it was something obviously not kosher, like roasted pig, but because it was food that might have been slaughtered in a questionable manner, prepared near food, sacrificed to idols, or other perceived contaminants. When it came to situations such as this, Paul understood that these complex and nuanced questions will produce many different answers by Jews. This is a good example of how Second Temple Judaism came to be so diverse in halakha while living in the Roman Empire. One of the prominent halakhic perspectives is that of the House of Hillel, a 1st century BCE continuing into the 1st century CE, a halakhic school whose teachings appear in the Mishnah, an important Jewish body of texts compiled around 200 CE. The Mishnah emphasizes the importance of intention when observing Torah. Mishnah Hagigah says, if he immersed but without special intention, it is as though he had not immersed. In light of this, Dr. Rudolph concludes, Paul's training as a Pharisee of Pharisees and his broad exposure to pluriform Second Temple Judaism made him into something of a first-century halakhic pluralist who favored the Hillelite emphasis on personal intention when it came to purity issues. Seen in this way, Paul's statement in Romans 14:14b, it is unclean for anyone who thinks it unclean, was not an expression of indifference toward ritual purity, but a claim consistent with the on-the-ground reality of a variegated first-century Judaism. This brings us to Paul's use of the qualifier in itself in the first half of verse 14. This indicates a shared underlying assumption behind the Hillelite view that personal intention can change the purity status of objects and persons. This would mean that the Hillelite view denies that something like pork is intrinsically unclean. This is shown in the Torah itself and in Second Temple Jewish literature. In Leviticus 11, the text clearly says that certain foods are unclean for you, that is, the Israelites. Gentiles were not required or expected to keep the food laws, and they were never judged for not doing so. Certain animals were declared unclean for Israelites simply because God declared it so, not because there is anything intrinsically unclean with the animal itself. This is why Gentiles are not held to the same dietary standards as Israelites. This is shown to be the understanding of the author of the letter of Aristeas, a Jewish text from the mid-2nd century BCE. It says, through these creatures then, by calling them unclean, God set up a symbol that those for whom the legislation was drawn up must practice righteousness in spirit and oppress no one. That is letter of Aristeas 147. This letter understood that kosher law was only for whom the Torah was given, the Israelites. Thus, Dr. Rudolph concludes, returning to Romans 14:14a, it is apparent that Paul was not making a radical statement when he wrote that nothing was unclean in itself. On the contrary, he was communicating a normative Hillelite perspective on ritual purity that already had a degree of acceptance in the wider Jewish diaspora. So what does this mean for the identification of the weak brothers and sisters in Rome? It means that Paul was not drawing a line along that of Jew and Gentile because he was speaking to Gentiles. Nor was he drawing a line along Torah observant or non-Torah observant because he was speaking about a halakhic gray area. But he was drawing a line between correct halakhic understanding of food law and incorrect halakhic understanding of food law. The weak were weak because they were judgmental and viewed ritual impurity and defilement as objective ontological realities. They lacked the knowledge and faith to believe that intention determined impurity, that individual standards of impurity could vary, and that God could overlook accidental mixtures. The strong were strong because they held a non-ontological view of purity. They knew that nothing was unclean in itself. The attitude of the strong is similar to Rabbinic Judaism today. According to Shulchan Aruch, a 16th century code of Jewish law that's really a foundational text for all of Jewish law that's practiced today, says, if pork accidentally falls into the traditional Jews' kosher food and the pork constitutes the minority of the food, then under the principle of Batul Barov, the pork may be legally nullified and eaten. So why might the weak view food as ontologically unclean? Dr. Rudolph suggests that it is perhaps because they were mostly from non-Jewish backgrounds and were even more zealous about Jewish life than even Jews were, as is even seen by Gentiles attracted to Judaism today. He says their Greco-Roman background of ritual impurity associated with magic and superstition could have led them to a more objective ontological way of thinking about the Jewish food laws. So there you have it. A person was weak if they viewed food as intrinsically unclean, and in Rome, these people likely happened to be Gentiles. A person was strong if they had an intention-oriented halakha, like Paul and Hillel. Though complex, I find this argument very fascinating and compelling. Tell me what you think in the comments below. If you found this helpful, enlightening, or challenging, please like, share, and subscribe. If you would like to support us, please do so through PayPal or Patreon. The links are in the description. Thank you again, and see you next time on Bible History.